The Japanese army engaged in fierce combat beside the Drare River in New Guinea. Hundreds of soldiers moved forward to take up positions along the riverbank under the glow of the midnight sun. Tall reeds helped conceal them from view, but they couldn't mask the sounds of tired men stumbling through the mud. Officers nervously listened for any sign that the enemy had detected their presence, while sergeants whispered orders to stay silent. The men of Major Moritoshi Kashi's 1st Battalion, 78th Infantry Regiment, felt more than fear in their stomachs as they awaited the order to attack. They were tormented by hunger. For weeks, they had been forced to eat grass and insects as they marched arduously through New Guinea's swamps and rainforests. Supplies were scarce and could not keep up. Kashi's soldiers had reached this point through sheer determination and unwavering discipline. But would their warrior mentality be enough to overcome the formidable American army opposing them? One man crouched beside the Drare River that night believed so. He was the architect of this desperate scheme and the commander of the Japanese 18th Army, Lieutenant General Hatazo Adachi. Massive Allied leapfrog invasions along northern New Guinea's coast in the spring of 1944 had isolated Adachi's command from the rest of Japan's Southern Army. With no chance of reinforcement, evacuation, or resupply, the 55,000 soldiers of the 18th Army were effectively left on their own by Imperial General Headquarters. The United States conducted simultaneous amphibious landings at Hollandia and Adepe in northern New Guinea on April 22, 1944. From his headquarters at Wewak, General Adachi considered every way to counter this threat, but he was powerless to prevent his soldiers' slow deaths from malnutrition and illness. He could strike the enemy 94 miles away at Adepe or attempt to break through Allied lines to rejoin Japanese forces far to the west. None of these options appealed to the 61-year-old commander. Every tenet of the Bushido warrior code, to which he had devoted his life, was broken by staying put in Wewak. The 18th Army had to travel 600 miles through unknown jungle territory to avoid Adepe and Hollandia and reach friendly forces. They were also short on food, transportation, and medical supplies. Adachi knew his men were insufficient for the journey, especially since many were already fatigued from earlier withdrawals throughout eastern New Guinea. Adachi's only remaining option was to launch an attack. He could have sent his best infantry formations against the Allied airfields at Adepe because he had 2 months' worth of supplies on hand. If the 18th Army was successful, it could then advance 120 miles west to take Hollandia and resupply itself with captured material. This plan, a reflection of the general who conceived it, depended more on the fighting spirit of the Japanese soldiers than on wise military tactics. On June 17, 1890, Hatazo Adachi, the son of an army officer, was born in Tokyo. Raised in the samurai tradition, the tall, well-set youth seemed destined to follow his father's military career. In 1910, Adachi became a lieutenant in the prestigious Imperial Guards Division after completing his studies at Tokyo Cadet Academy. The values of stoicism, selflessness, and physical toughness, already fundamental to his character, were emphasized during peacetime duty. After serving in combat in Manchuria and China in the 1930s, Adachi, now a colonel and regimental commander, gained a reputation for bravery. He typically led from the front where the fighting was most intense, refusing the benefits that other officers of his rank and status would ordinarily receive. He also experienced the dangers of combat firsthand, suffering permanent limps from mortar fragments to his face, neck, and leg. By 1940, Adachi had gradually received promotions and was wearing the insignia of a lieutenant general. In the fall of 1941, he was appointed Chief of Staff of the South China Area Army after successfully leading the 37th Division in combat. After leading the recently established 18th Army for a year, he departed China and set up headquarters on the island of New Guinea. When Adachi arrived in January 1943, he saw firsthand the grim reality that Japanese forces had been vanquished in combat. After a bloody battle, enemy forces had taken control of Buma, a vital port town. The remaining garrison fled westward, leaving behind most of their supplies and injured comrades. The military situation was turning against Lieutenant General Adachi and his leadership. He now had to defend 400 miles of coastline against an enemy that dominated the sky and sea, a nearly impossible task. Reinforcements had to endure a barrage of air and naval attacks just to reach the 18th Army's theater of operations. Ultimately, the combined strength of the Japanese combat forces in eastern New Guinea, the 20th, 41st, and 51st Divisions, amounted to 60,000 men. Even so, each of these units lacked sufficient strength. For example, during the Battle of the Bismarck Sea in March 1943, 8 transport vessels carrying the 51st Division were sunk, resulting in the loss of 3,000 soldiers and most of its crew served weapons. Adachi barely avoided a similar fate when the destroyer transporting him and his staff to their new headquarters was damaged by enemy bombs. A scratch force of 9,000 Japanese Army and Navy personnel guarded important airfields at Lae and Salamaua. The Australian and American infantry forces that the Allies sent ashore in June threatened the defenders by trapping them between 2 fast-moving assault columns. Those fit enough to march were ordered to retreat overland across the formidable Sarawaj Mountains. They gathered rations for 10 days and embarked on a heroic journey to safety. Their ranks were decimated by exposure, starvation, and malaria. No one expected the peaks to still be covered in snow in July. Of the 8,600 soldiers who began this month-long journey, 2,200 did not survive the jungle ordeal. The fate of the Lae Salamaua garrison highlighted the difficulties of conducting warfare in this region of the world, the second largest island in the world. New Guinea, covering 488,000 square miles, remained largely unknown to the outside world until 1943 to 1944. Vast areas of land were unmapped and unexplored on Japanese maps, concealing their unfathomable dangers from those who had to live, fight, and die there. Miles of miasmic swamps and tropical rainforests surrounded the coast, where rich fertile soil and heavy rainfall, over 100 inches annually, allowed dense vegetation to flourish. However, very few plants were edible, leading many Japanese soldiers to deride New Guinea as the Green Desert. The massive Owen Stanley Range, New Guinea's rugged mountain spine, began at low foothills 5 to 50 miles inland. From these heights, streams carved wide rivers and steep valleys that could only be crossed by boat or bridge, funneling rainfall into the ocean. Scattered along the northern coast were small native villages and colonial ports, connected by footpaths or occasional roads that quickly turned to mud during the rainy season. Tropical illnesses native to New Guinea resisted therapeutic intervention. Without insect nets, bodies were plagued by mosquitoes carrying malaria, and large feral rats spread the crippling disease typhus. Numerous issues were presented by the tropical weather itself. Daytime highs of over 100 degrees Fahrenheit were common, as was oppressively high humidity. And then it started to rain. It rained nonstop for over 6 months, recollected Sergeant Masatsu Ola of the 20th Division's 79th Regiment. Our weapons developed rust. Iron simply corroded away. Injuries would not mend. Lieutenant General Adachi was concerned about the increasing enemy presence in the skies above and the seas surrounding New Guinea. In addition to geographical and meteorological difficulties, American medium and heavy bombers had methodically destroyed Japan's 4th Air Army during 1943 and early 1944. Air Force 5, moving fighter aircraft from the United States and Australia along with Allied warships, overpowered the tiny Ninth Fleet. Now, during the day, its surviving flotilla of coastal patrol boats and cargo barges followed the shore, emerging only at night to deliver critical supplies and personnel. Battle-hardened diggers from the 7th Australian Infantry Division landed near Finschhafen on the Huon Peninsula of New Guinea in late September 1943. Adachi responded by directing yet another combat withdrawal, sending his already beaten legions west once more to strongholds at Wewak, Hansa Bay, and Madang. After a 3-month march through extremely difficult conditions, mostly at night, the 18th Army closed on these objectives. Japan's Imperial General Headquarters, HQ, had to reassess its strategic position in the south due to the shifting tides of war. On September 30, 1943, senior staff officers in Tokyo modified the Army's main defense line across New Guinea. Effect on March 14, 1944, Adachi had previously been stationed in Rabaul, New Britain, with the 8th Area Army led by Lieutenant General Hitoshi Imamura. This change in command occurred when it was evident that Imamura could no longer effectively oversee the operations of the 18th Army due to his isolation from the advancing Allied forces. The truth was that HQ lacked a workable plan to defend New Guinea with the limited resources at their disposal. None of the officers in Japan's high command could stop the enemy's relentless advance. In the spring of 1944, Tokyo sent General Anami in Davao a series of contradictory orders, directing Adachi's command to hold key territory along the northeastern coastline of New Guinea, while also pulling all major combat elements westward toward the main defense line. These dispatches, unaware of the realities of fighting and marching in New Guinea, frequently directed troop movements down to the last detail. One message ordered the 18th Army to walk the 215 miles to Hollandia in an unimaginably short amount of time. General Anami, frustrated, wrote in his diary, "The Imperial General Headquarters is disordered like hamstrung." Even so, the commander of the 2nd Area Army quietly objected to Tokyo's unrealistic orders, which were obediently forwarded to Lieutenant General Adachi for implementation. But the commander of the 18th Army, located 1,300 miles east, had a very different perspective. Japanese patrols started reporting signs of an impending Allied invasion of Wewak as March gave way to April. On adjacent beaches, rubber rafts, evidence of seaborne reconnaissance teams, were found, and the number of enemy aircraft in the skies overhead continued to rise. Lieutenant General Adachi decided to defy orders and protect the Wewak-Hansa Bay area, informing his superiors via radio. Unbeknownst to the Japanese, every wireless message sent or received by the 18th Army was being read by the Allies, thanks to ULTRA, the top-secret signals intelligence source. The U.S. Supreme Commander of Allied Forces in the Southwest Pacific area, General Douglas MacArthur, knew that his deception strategy was working. Adachi was waiting at Wewak, having taken the bait from inflatable dinghies left on likely beachheads. MacArthur also had access to the approximate positions and numbers of all Japanese units in New Guinea, information he quickly used to his advantage. On April 22, 1944, American combat troops conducted a series of audacious amphibious operations, storming ashore near the weakly fortified airfields at Hollandia and Adape in western New Guinea. The Allies took a calculated risk by landing between the formidable 18th Army and the rest of Anami's 2nd Area Army, but MacArthur was confident that his radio interception teams would provide timely warnings of any Japanese counterattack. American forces adapted to Adachi's plans in time to confront and eliminate the threat. The commanders of the Japanese forces in New Guinea also desired an attack at Wewak. Lieutenant General Adachi and his superior, General Anami, felt they had what it took to defeat the Allied positions at Adape and Hollandia. On April 25, Anami moved his headquarters from Davao to Manado in the Salives. However, their plan did not align with HQ's perspective, and on May 2, Tokyo ordered yet another strategic withdrawal, this time further into New Guinea's Vogelkop Peninsula. Once more, Anami ordered the 18th Army to advance westward and join his forces in defending the Vogelkop. The Americans cut off all communication between Lieutenant General Adachi's command and the 2nd Area Army on May 27 when they invaded Biak. On June 20, HQ subordinated the 18th Army directly to the Southern Army headquarters in Singapore, acknowledging that there was nothing more that could be done to assist that formation. Essentially, Tokyo left Adachi and his men to fend for themselves, ordering them to simply carry out holding operations to sustain key areas in the region. Adachi had learned how to think in addition to obeying orders during a lifetime of service. His military tradition required him to show initiative, even if it meant defying orders. Lieutenant General Adachi had also vowed, as did all fighting men of Japan, to sacrifice his life if needed to protect his emperor and country. "We want to live," he wrote in May. "If we cannot have both, we should discard life and cling to honor." Adachi presented his officers with a plan to capture Adape, codenamed Operation E, on May 5. A few days later, multiple long-range reconnaissance platoons embarked on foot to survey the American positions and provide their findings. Soldiers from the 20th and 41st Divisions began to gather at the 18th Army's base at Wewak, approximately concurrent with their movements out of Manang and Hansa Bay. With 5,000 riflemen between them, These were Adachi's most formidable commands, but they also had the furthest distance to march. WWII is 200 trail miles away from Madang. With the exception of one regiment, the 51st Division was held back as Adachi's rear guard to impede the Australian forces' slow advance westward from Lai. A further 3,000 recuperating soldiers remained in the hospital, and a great number of fit soldiers, up to 6 men for each combatant on the front lines, were assigned to porter duties, carrying rations, ammo, and even pieces of mountain artillery. In all, about 35,000 Japanese soldiers departed for Adape in May and June of 1944. On May 10, the landing barge carrying 20th Division Commander Lieutenant General Shigeru Katagiri struck an Allied sea mine off the coast of WWII, severely hampering Adachi's campaign. Both Katagiri and his whole staff were killed in the explosion. Shortly afterward, an enemy airstrike claimed the lives of 6 senior officers from the 41st Division, causing yet another crisis. Soon, the absence of these seasoned leaders would be deeply felt. Lieutenant General Adachi led the main contingent of soldiers marching on Adape, as was his custom. His capable chief of staff, Lieutenant General Kichi Yoshiwara, remained in WWII. Yoshiwara's enormous task was to maintain supplies for the 18th Army throughout its assault. Yoshiwara's men carried all the food and ammunition that was needed, but it was insufficient. The 3rd Battalion, 80th Infantry Regiment survivors recalled that they received less than 12 ounces of rice per day, and biscuits came once every 2 or 3 days. Every 10 days, 3 valuable cigarettes were given to each man. Sago palm leaves were consumed by many soldiers as a supplement to their meager rations, but as the fatigued and unclean Japanese columns moved west, malnutrition began to set in. Adachi originally gave his columns an 8 miles per day goal, which was reasonable considering the difficult terrain of New Guinea. However, that number was cut in half very quickly. Every marching unit had countless stragglers huddling behind them, and the supply of supplies had virtually stopped. For those who had to walk through the jungle, it was a nightmare come true, as essential supplies like salt and medications were just non-existent. Then, to add to everyone's misery, the heavens opened up to unleash a summertime rainfall torrent. It was awful to march in the rain, recalled 20th Division Sergeant Masatsu Ogawa. Drops landed on my cap and mixed with my perspiration. You staggered, got back up, sprawled out, and stood like a horde of marching mud dolls. It was endless, just slogging through the murky water, trailing the legs of the person ahead of you. Men started to pass away. According to Ogawa, soldiers who had struggled along before them littered the sides of the trail. It was a horrifying sight. Road markers beckoned Ogawa forward, as the remains of his doomed comrades, some of whom were already skeletons, appeared to say, "This is how you do it. All you have to do is follow his corpses to get there." The promise of American rations that had been taken at Adape, along with the Japanese spirit of defiance, propelled the troops ahead. More incentive came from witnessing their commanding general share every adversity with his men. Adachi had a terrible hernia, but few knew it because he wore a mask of stoic indifference and continued to walk. Because flying enemy aircraft made daytime travel too dangerous, the soldiers moved by night. They would try to sleep in the oppressive rainforest at dawn, eat what food was available, and dream of the feasts that would await them when their enemy was vanquished. Additionally, Lieutenant General Adachi faithfully updated the Allied code breakers on his whereabouts via radio every morning. As a result, MacArthur was fully aware of the locations of Adachi's marching columns and their planned offensive. The Americans holding Adape readied themselves to face the onslaught of the 18th Army while keeping a close eye on Adachi's communications, ensuring they stayed a step ahead. Australian signal intercept teams closely monitored the arduous march of Japanese troops across New Guinea. The soldiers of Task Force Persecution, led by U.S. Army Major General William H. Gill of the 32nd Infantry Division, faced Adachi's men 8 miles east of Adape at Taji. Gill's airfields were surrounded by a semicircle that held most of his defenses. However, Gill sent a covering force to the banks of the Driniuma River, 15 miles to the east, to get advance notice of the impending Japanese attack. Under the leadership of Brigadier General Clarence A. Martin, this formation comprised 3,500 riflemen and was supported by artillery, armor, PT boats, and close air support from Bristol Beaufighter bombers of No. 71 Wing, Royal Australian Air Force. On May 22, advanced elements of Adachi's 20th Division nearly cut off an American reconnaissance patrol operating near the coastal village of Niumen. This resulted in the first points of contact between the two adversaries. A larger engagement occurred at Yakimal, 3 miles west of Niumen, in early June when riflemen from the 78th and 80th Infantry Regiments ambushed an entire U.S. battalion. On June 5, Japanese soldiers were closing in for the kill, only to watch in frustration as Allied landing craft arrived to save the last company of geese stuck on the beach. Generals Gill and Martin had by this point given up doubting Adachi's impending arrival. They were further persuaded by Japanese operation orders captured later in June. Although the exact time and location of the attack remained unclear, the strong counter-reconnaissance screening of the 18th Army prevented enemy ground patrols from getting through, and false readings of ultra-intercepts gave Allied commanders a false sense of security. The 18th Army was supposed to attack on June 15 according to MacArthur's intelligence staff. However, after this date passed without incident, many American officers surmised that the Japanese had already begun their retreat back to Wewak. By July 1, American troops had lost all contact with Adachi's forces along the Drinimur line. Another planned assault for June 27 never happened, and unbelievably, Adachi's radio also stopped working, infuriating the Allied ultra-intercept teams. Nonetheless, in the uncharted jungle east of the Drinimur River, 20,000 Japanese combat soldiers were gathering in preparation for battle. Lieutenant General Adachi repeatedly delayed the offensive due to supply issues, troop movement delays, and his soldiers mounting fatigue. But by the second week of July, he felt prepared to launch an attack. Often within yards of the American earthworks, the commanding general personally delivered his final attack orders, no longer requiring a radio to stay in contact with his subordinates. The long-range reconnaissance patrols of the 18th Army had done their jobs well. They reported with accuracy the number of GITs stationed around the Taji airfields and the locations of all enemy supply dumps, aid stations, and command posts. The Japanese also knew that with 3 battalions dispersed over a 6-mile front, their enemy was vulnerable and overextended along the Drinimur. Lieutenant General Adachi pleaded with his assembled commanders, "We have to strike now before our enemy reinforces his weakly held river positions." He intended to launch a direct frontal attack on the evening of July 10 to 11. 3 infantry regiments would cross the Drinimur at midnight, overwhelm the American defenses there, and regroup before resuming their advance against Task Force Persecution's main line of resistance around the Taji airfields following a 10-minute artillery preparation. A supporting attack along the coast aimed to destroy American artillery positions near the river mouth. This attack involved elements of the 41st Division, led by Lieutenant General Goro Mano, and the 20th Division, under Major General Masazumi Inukai. Adachi's main effort was to be made by the 237th Infantry Regiment of Mano's 41st Division, which was arriving on the Drinimur under the command of Colonel Masahiko Nakamura. Colonels Tokutaro Iida and Natsuro Matsumoto led the 20th Division's 80th and 78th Infantry Regiments, advancing to Nakamura's left. Major Iza Hoshino of the 41st Mountain Artillery Regiment commanded the Coastal Attack Force. Army Reserve members were attached to the 66th Infantry Regiment of the 51st Division. Adachi's troops would cross the Drinimur River, which rises high in the Torricelli Mountains and bends north toward the coast at a group of aboriginal huts known as Afua, 6 miles away. At this point, the river's water only reached waist depth, and the current became sluggish. The normal jungle understory on both sides had been replaced by tall reeds, creating an average river width of 100 yards. The attackers were guided toward their target by a number of small islands, the most notable of which was designated Konakai Shima, or Middle of the River Island, on Japanese maps. Although General Adachi was well informed about his adversaries, he was still missing some vital details. American infantrymen had just registered probable targets for artillery and built barbed wire obstacles in front of their fighting positions. The enemy had also been bolstered. A full 3,000-man regiment was in reserve nearby, and 5 battalions, 2 dismounted cavalry and 3 infantry, were dug in on the Drinimur front. The Japanese were unaware that Major General Gill had been replaced by U.S. Army Commander Major General Charles P. Hall, as the commander of Task Force Persecution, V Corps. Hall, succumbing to pressure from an irritated General MacArthur, decided to destroy the 18th Army instead of allowing Adachi's men to sacrifice themselves on his defensive lines. He sent out 2 battalion-sized patrols from the persecution covering force on July 10, 1944. One patrol moved along the Pacific coast, and the other headed south toward Afua to locate and destroy the Phantom Army to free up Allied forces needed for the upcoming campaign in the Philippines. Hall's timing couldn't have been worse. Both of his patrols, navigating the impenetrable rainforest, entirely missed the 18th Army, which was finalizing its own assault plans that same evening. Unbelievably, Hall removed these 2 battalions from the Guinea line instead of from his reserve, significantly reducing the combat strength of the persecution covering force just when it was most needed. Adachi's attack columns also suffered last-minute issues. The strongest unit in the 18th Army, Colonel Nara's 237th Infantry, arrived late and neglected to carry out crucial pre-battle reconnaissance. The 78th and 80th Infantry regiments were hopelessly mixed together in the 20th Division zone, and there was not enough time for the officers to resolve the situation before the attack started. An unexpected barrage of artillery fire on July 10 at 23:50 hours drove stunned soldiers of the 2nd Battalion, 128th Infantry Regiment, deep into their foxholes. As the Americans were still being suppressed by machine guns and mortars, thousands of Japanese soldiers then rose to their feet and started running forward as parachute flares lit up the sky. Adachi's attack was launched 5 minutes ahead of schedule by Major Moritoshi Kawagashi, with 400 soldiers from the 1st Battalion, 78th Infantry Regiment. They dashed toward the river just before midnight, reaching halfway across before American artillery started to fire. Among them, strategically placed enemy automatic weapons also stung the Japanese, causing their attack to stall in the middle. Kawagashi's soldiers were all but destroyed within minutes, either dead or injured along the banks of the Guinea. Yet another group of riflemen broke through the reeds on Kawagashi's right flank. The primary effort of the 18th Army was carried out by Major Shoji Miyashida's 1st Battalion, 237th Infantry. Amidst the confusion, one company inadvertently ventured onto Kanakaishima and met its demise at the hands of American small arms fire. The rest of the 1st Battalion pressed into an increasingly powerful avalanche of explosions from mortars, grenades, and cannons. Miyashida's forces were completely destroyed as deadly metal fragments crashed into them in torrential waves. After that, the enemy's howitzers switched their focus to other targets, leaving a hauntingly quiet battlefield in their wake. But now, the second echelon of Adachi's forces was emerging. Hundreds more Japanese fighting men stepped over the corpses of their comrades in a desperate attempt to move forward. American defenders watched in horror as their screams of pain, the orders of the officers, and the deepening din of gunfire blended together to create an unbearable noise. Barbed wire entanglements placed to protect the GIS foxholes were obscured by smoke and dust raised by the bombardment from both sides. Although many Japanese infantrymen lost their lives attempting to overcome these barriers, their sheer numbers soon started to show. Lack of ammunition caused American machine guns to go silent, and mortars and artillery were unable to fire for fear of hitting their own people. Company E of the 128th Infantry was overrun to the north. Adachi's men had triumphed. An additional attack that started at 5:00 hours strengthened the 18th Army's position along the Guinea. By July 11 dawn, it was evident that the attackers had broken through the enemy's defenses, tearing a 2,000-yard hole. This forced the persecution covering force, which included its 2 battalions sent out on patrol earlier, to retreat quickly. About M10 tank destroyers on the beach and rocket-firing ulsims. Landing craft mechanized, offshore supported their attack. By dusk, the Allied firepower was so great that the remaining pieces of Hino's coastal attack force were cut off and rendered useless. Now that the Americans controlled the mouth of the Guinea, the 1/128th Infantry headed south, aiming to rendezvous with the 112th Cavalry, who were pushing north from their base at Afua, 6 miles upstream. Thousands of Japanese combatants stood between them, depleted of ammunition but brimming with the delectable certainty of victory. Under the American ponchos, their skin felt dried for once, and their bellies were stuffed full of confiscated sea rations. On July 14, Lieutenant General Adachi took some time to rearrange his army. Adachi united his 78th and 80th Infantry Regiments under Major General Sahiro Miyake of the 20th Division after realizing the tremendous losses sustained by those units. Then, just northwest of Afua, this so-called macaque force took control of a jungle ridge right in front of the U.S. 112th Cavalry Regiment that was making its advance. The center of the Guinea River line, Afua, was desired by both parties. The 18th Army and an expanding American combat team centered on the 112th Cavalry fought for control of this backcountry crossroads for almost a month. After being continuously bombarded, Afua's 10 native huts changed hands at least 6 times in the remaining days of July and the first part of August. The macaque force continued to lose soldiers due to illness, ambushes by the enemy, and general fatigue throughout this time. Perhaps the best way to sum up the difficulties of fighting a long war like the one along the Guinea was described by U.S. Army historian Robert Ross Smith in his official campaign memoir for over the course of the following few days. The Japanese launched a number of minor attacks, but their main purpose was to conceal the withdrawal of the main force. Subsequently, patrols near the Guinea River were horrified at the devastation that had occurred there in the previous 25 days. One 112th Cavalry soldier remembered believing the stream was full of logs. When he looked closer, he saw that those logs were actually hundreds of dead Japanese soldiers. Adachi's forces had, in fact, been completely decimated throughout this campaign. It is estimated that nearly 10,000 of his men were killed or reported missing, though the precise number of Japanese casualties may never be known. Not surprisingly, the majority of battle fatalities happened in infantry formations of the 18th Army. For example, the 78th Regiment, which had 1,300 effectives going into the fight, came out with 350, meaning that 73% of its combat strength was lost in action. Comparable figures were listed by other units. Task Force Persecution reported 2,550 injuries, 10 missing, and 440 killed. U.S. patrols pursued the Japanese back toward WWII for several weeks, engaging in a number of close-quarter skirmishes with Adachi's rear guard. On August 25, Major General Hall declared the 8-day operation to be over. Still, the 18th Army's ordeal went on. After WWII was taken by the Australian 6th Division in May 1945, the garrison was forced to flee deep into the mountains, where they stayed until the end of the war. Just 13,000 of the estimated 150,000 Japanese soldiers who fought alongside Adachi in New Guinea made it to captivity with their commanding general. Adachi was found guilty of war crimes and given a life sentence for the atrocities his men had committed against Allied prisoners and civilians in New Guinea during World War II. However, on September 10, 1947, he killed himself ritualistically with a parry